Good evening, everybody, and from myself, from the IFBL, my name is Ben Lyon. I'd like to welcome you to this evening's event. It's a slightly different event for us this evening. It's about plain language, something that we don't normally talk about always at the IFBL, where we're looking at accountancy and depository banks and things like this. So again, this is an evening which is a little bit special for us. For those that know the IFBL, you'll know that we're a network. And again, a network which is very, very important for the activities and the actions that we undertake. And having joined the IFBL about 2.5 years ago, I'm now, call me a late starter, but I'm starting to understand just the challenge which the IFBL has in trying to fulfill its mandate in supporting the Luxembourg marketplace in its way forward, and as to become a financial centre on a global stage. So from that point of view, and having this challenge in front of us, it would be rather daunting if we didn't have so many people that are actually interested in what the IFBL does, both as trainers, people that create courses, people that send their people to actually go and sit in our courses, and for which we actually can then go and develop other ones. It's extremely important. But tonight is not about the IFBL. It's very much about plain language. So plain language, what is this? What's so special about it? What can it do for you? Why is it in the news? So plain language is not something which is new. It's been around for a very long time. And if you start a little bit of research on it, you'll start looking back to about the 1940s. 1940s of people like Stuart Chase, as he started to complain about English as looking at what is gobbledygook, jargon, legalese. This was in 1940. Again, unfortunately for those that work in this industry, so many of you are probably from finance, you'll probably still be blatantly aware that these words haven't disappeared. So certainly tonight is becoming, and also it's a topic that we want to bring a little bit more to the fore. Around the globe, of course, it's very interesting to look at what other people are doing. And of course, in the US, again, really leading the way in what is going on in plain language. Plain language there has gone through several administrations, and they're actually enacting this in their legislation. So the latest culminating in 2010 with the legislation enacted by Obama for all the federal agencies, actually mandating them and pushing them to actually use plain language within their documentation. And of course, the new regulations also in Luxembourg and also at European level, pushing for the same thing within financial services. So there we are. So for tonight we have some very special speakers for us, and also a few words as to how we can actually approach this. So first up we have Josiah Fisk. So Josiah Fisk has come all the way from Boston, and also certainly very important for us this evening is to get also a point of view that comes from outside Luxembourg. So Josiah is the founder of MoreCarrot, a company which he'll happily introduce you to if you don't know it. But before this particular project, I didn't know Josiah, but it's been an enormous pleasure to work with you. So welcome this evening, Josiah, and we look forward to your presentation. The second part of the presentation, so the first part will be more generics, easing you into the topic, looking at the way that people are starting to think about plain language. How does that fit into today's world? The second part of the presentation, which is going to be held by Luxembourg's own Emmanuel Bégard. Emmanuel is a very important person for us at the IFBL, not just for things to do with plain language, but also on the ALFI side of things. He's the secretary of the ALFI Training Commission. And at that point of view, as me being at ALFI, he's my main contact there. Even within our courses, we've also been trying to introduce notions of plain text, trying to take away whole cut and pasted sections of legalese and replace those with short and succinct phrases. Again, the response to these is not always exactly what you'd expect, but we're feeling that we're moving in the right direction, trying to make some more space for our trainers to actually interact with a little bit more actively with the people who are actually sitting in the classes. So Emmanuel is the founding partner of Epsilon, a company which was set up 2 years ago, a company which has seen enormous success since its launch, and also a company which uses, like Josiah's, plain language as a competitive advantage in whatever he does. So plain language, it's not for me to talk about it, it's more for our experts this evening. So what I'd like to do is hand over the floor first of all to Josiah, and before that, thank you very much indeed for coming. I'm going to say, have a very pleasant evening.
Thank you. I'd like to start by saying that I think the best way to talk about plain language, and I'm going to be giving a very, very sort of 50,000-foot view, the larger context of plain language. And I think that it's probably the best way for me to do that is not to talk about what plain language does and what plain language is. Emmanuel is going to do a very good job of that in his presentation. But to give you a bit of the feeling of this context, and I'm going to do that, I think, by the best way is by talking about some of the questions that plain language asks and the sort of the philosophy that it comes from. So the first question, really almost the most important one, what are the concerns of users? That's really the basis of plain language. We start from this question and see where it takes us. So I'm going to start with a very small example, a road sign. Road signs, I kind of like them as examples because we're all, they're very simple, and we're all on equal footing as users of road signs. We all have felt the terrible feelings that happen when they aren't right, when they're incomprehensible, and so it's kind of an interesting example. So suppose you were driving along and you saw this, outdoor dining facilities. Well, you might, a minute down the road figure out what they meant, but by that time it would be too late to take advantage of these facilities. So I think we can say this sign doesn't really work very well. So the typical plain language approach would be, let's start to take a look at the words. So why don't we change it to so it says picnic facilities. Now that's still sort of a little bit complicated, but now we're getting there. At least we see the word picnic. But I think there's other things that we want to think about in terms of the users here. So we want to say, well, is talking about the facilities the right question at all? Is that really what we should be talking about? Are there other concerns that they might have? For instance, should we just say rest area? I mean, that's pretty clear. It doesn't get the picnic idea across, but maybe that's the quickest communication. Should we perhaps talk about sort of what you do to in the course of using this, which is to turn out onto the side pavement there? Maybe that would be the best way to talk about it. Maybe we should talk about it in terms of sort of what it is in the midst of your journey, and so maybe we should call it a travel break. I don't happen to think any of these work very well, but they sort of, as an exercise, tell you the kinds of things that we might think about. I think that probably picnic facilities, we would just keep going, and call it picnic area. And in fact, that's pretty much been the standard language for this sort of location for many years. The next question is, what can we do without? And this is obviously a very important question. I think it's one that you would expect to be asked in plain language. We're always looking for words that aren't necessary, but sometimes perhaps even entire sections that aren't necessary. So let's look at this. This is something that when you get on a plane in the US and you go to get your boarding pass at the kiosk, the government wants you to read this. Well, I read it and I spent some time with it, and actually what it really boils down to is this. To help keep air travel safe, the federal government requires that you tell us your full name, date of birth, and gender. That's pretty much all they were saying with all of that. So it seems as if there was rather a lot that we could live without. The government didn't bother to ask the question whether they could live without it, and so everyone, and I think if you do the math and how many millions of travelers every year pass through, and if it only takes them 5 seconds, and you still end up with some amazing amount of time, the nation's time that has been wasted. I mean, it might have been worth their asking this question. So that's one of the questions that we also ask. Here's the very important question. Are the visual cues helping or hurting? And I'll show you just how powerful the visual cues can be with some examples here. This is an actual menu from Microsoft Excel. And they want you to choose the orientation of the printout that you're going to ask for. The visual cues suggest that obviously these two things go together because they're close. Well, in fact, these two things on the left and those two things on the right go together. The visual cueing is off. So what could we do about that? Well, the first thing that we could do is that. Instantly we see the right visual cue. The portrait image is next to the portrait, the landscape image is next to the landscape. And I think we could keep going with this a little bit. I think that there, for instance, I'm not really sure why the icon on the right is tipped up like that. I think it would make more sense to have the image of the person always be horizontal, or always be right side up, I should say. And then I think, well, what are those arrows doing? They're saying up is up, I think. They're not really doing much. And what are those turned down corners in the icons doing? I'm not really sure they're doing much. Let's get rid of those. That's a little bit cleaner. Now we can maybe try experimenting moving things around. We could see if that works a little bit better. We could line things up over on the left. We could make the icons a bit larger. And you know what? Maybe we don't even need the words. Perfectly clear, I think, that you, for orientation, you want it this way, you want it that way. You can check one, and there you are. Are our priorities blinding us to the user's priorities? If that question may seem a little bit abstract, let's take a look at this. There's a company that makes a laundry starch called Easy On. This company also, in order to leverage the brand, has a oven cleaner called Easy Off. And from a point of branding, this is great. Let's make them look alike. So they've done that. Same type of container, the same color. We have the same font for the name, almost the same name. We've got yellow block letters on each one of these. We have a yellow starburst on each one of these. If you want to actually see what it is, it's very small. That on the left says oven cleaner, but you really have to look hard. It's not the first or second thing you'd see, not even the third or fourth thing. So this is great from a branding standpoint. We can see these brands go together very well. But when you reach into your cabinet to clean your oven, are you going to end up spraying it with starch? Well, that's a good question. And I think that's what I mean when I say the priorities of the person who's doing the communicating or the entity, are they not perhaps looking at some of the needs of the customer? What is the cost of not fixing it? This woman here can tell you this cost very well. She has this expression on her face because she has just more or less single-handedly elected this man president of the United States. Now, you might ask how this is possible in a country of 300 plus million people. Well, I'll show you. This was the ballot in Palm Beach County, Florida, November 7th, 2000, as some of you may remember. We'll take a closer look at this. You can see there's candidates on both sides. There are punch holes down the middle. They didn't have enough room on one side, so they had to put the candidates on both sides. It's called the butterfly ballot. Let's take a look here. Republican, Democrat, the two main parties. Let's just take a look at the visual cues that you would get. Let's just say you're going to vote Republican. Well, you read that, and your eye, as it sweeps across the word Republican, sees this nice guideline that guides you over to the center here. Well, there's no punch hole here, but there's one down there, so okay, that must be it. So you punch that hole. You have, in fact, voted correctly if you wanted to vote Republican. Let's try the same exercise with Democratic. Your eye sweeps across. There's this nice guideline. You don't see it as a dividing line because your eye just follows it. Oh, and there's a punch hole. It turns out, of course, it's the one for the Reform Party, but you don't look at that because you've found a punch hole that you think is right. So, and here's another thing that's going on. Look at the distance between the name of the main candidate and the punch hole. It's pretty far away. Even worse for the Democrat. And this, let me tell you, in terms of communications and what white space means, that is the Sahara Desert. And trying to make it across that is just very hard. Anything could happen. Your eye can go anywhere. It's very confusing. So then there's this other thing that's going on. There are these little numbers. These numbers have nothing to do with anything. We're not voting for number 3. Why is number 3 the first one anyway? They're obviously something that is sort of to do with the voting hardware. But they've been put in there. And look what happens when you get rid of them. You actually see the arrow. You might have had half a chance of seeing that, but because the number was there, it was confusing, and you didn't really see it. We could continue until we maybe had a design that made it almost impossible to punch the wrong hole. It's not that hard. It's very simple. It's got one color, pretty ugly type. Nothing much going on there. But if you see, these lead you right to the correct punch hole. But that didn't happen. Instead, what happened was that the Reform Party in this one county got more than 3 times the votes that they got anywhere else because of this visual cue. 19,000 ballots were disqualified because people voted twice. These are the people that said, oops, wait a minute, I didn't mean that hole, I meant this other hole. But when they count them, the person isn't around to ask them which one they mean, so they have to discard the ballot. 537 votes determined the entire election, and that determined the entire presidency. Or we could say that it was really just one person who determined this election, one person who didn't understand the principles of good communication. But smart, highly trained people are different, right? They don't make these sorts of mistakes. Well, let's take a look. Here is a paralyzing drug that is used in surgery. And here is the drug that reverses the paralyzing drug. And in this particular, yes, exactly. In this particular hospital, they were in the same container type, the same cap and label color, and the same drawer. And guess what? 5 out of 6 surgeons at this hospital actually gave the wrong drug at least once. Now, nobody died, and that's actually the only reason we know about this, because if they had, it would have been really impossible for anyone to admit that this had happened. So what did they do? They switched to color-coded containers. They put each drug in a different drawer, and that was the end of the problem. Something similar is documented by Atul Gawande in his 2009 bestseller, The Checklist Manifesto. And what he did was he went around and he said, let's use a 5-step checklist, very simple checklist, in intensive care units to see if we can bring down infection. 1 year later, it was brought down by 2/3. 1,500 lives were saved, $200 million were saved. And that was just in one state in the United States. Okay, that's enough for brain surgeons. Let's go on to rocket scientists. Would you launch the Challenger? Well, this is the data that you would need to know about answering that question, and this is in fact the data that the people at NASA looked at in deciding whether or not to launch the Challenger in that very cold morning. Here are the areas where there were failures in O-rings of previous firings of the same type of rocket that was used. If you can't see a pattern, I don't blame you, there really isn't one. However, if we take this exact same data and we graph it this way, where the failure, the seriousness of the failure is the vertical axis, the temperature is the horizontal axis, we see a very clear pattern. If we extrapolate this pattern, which is a reasonable thing to do, we see that when you get down to very low temperatures, there is potentially an extremely high risk that the O-ring will fail. The one piece of information that you don't have on here, but which NASA did have on the day of the launch, is the predicted temperatures for that day, and they're there. No person who had seen this graph could possibly have decided to go ahead with this launch. And if they had, they would have been unable to justify that decision because it's perfectly obvious that that is not a reasonable risk to have taken. They had all of the data, the people who made the decision to launch the Challenger, but they didn't have it in this form, and they didn't see the pattern, and the launch went ahead with tragic results, as we all recall. So what can we learn from this? The first thing I think is accuracy is not the same thing as communication. Suppose we had a sign that said rustic meal supporting structures. Entirely accurate description of a picnic table. I don't really think it's very helpful, though. I think you'd be really, quite a ways down the road before you figured that one out. Perfectly accurate, specific, precise text from the United States government, full of things with privacy impact assessment, which is undoubtedly a defined term someplace, published system of records notice, under the authority of a citation statute. This is all very precise, but it doesn't really help anybody understand anything. Another insight, words alone are rarely sufficient for good communication, and sometimes, as we've seen, they're not needed at all. So here's one of my favorite cartoons. You go onto someone's property, and there's a dog that comes up and it barks at you, except this dog doesn't bark. This happens to be a very unusual dog. It possesses the gift of human speech. And so instead of barking, the dog says, "You are trespassing on private property, and I'd like you to leave. I don't know how I can make it any clearer than that." Well, every dog in the world can make it clearer than that, except this one. I mean, the gift of words is, in fact, doing this dog no good whatsoever. We could do a whole lot better without any words. And I think that's always a good lesson to keep in mind is, do we need words at all? So here we saw that we didn't need any. Here we saw that the words, although they were accurate on these medical vials, were completely overruled in some cases by the visual cues. Here we see words, picnic area, not bad, but let's put this to the test. Perhaps we could just have an icon. Perhaps we don't need those words. Perhaps we can even make it look sort of nice with this tree. And the entire message is communicated. The interesting thing about this sign is it works better for every audience. It's certainly better for low literacy or non-native speakers, but it's also really good for people of any literacy level. They will read it. It will be a quick read. Everyone will understand what's going on. The sign that says picnic area has no advantage for any user population over this one. Here, remember, the great exercise in branding that confuses people. In fact, the company did figure it out. They changed the relative size or proportion of the containers. They changed the type for easy on. And most importantly, you'll see there's a little picture of an oven on the oven cleaner and a picture of a shirt. But what about things that mostly require words? So here's an example of some words. I'll let you look at it for a minute. Okay, time's up. I'll bet you didn't get very much out of it. Yeah, exactly. You didn't get very much out of it. Now, I'm going to add 8 words to this page and take another look at it and see what you think. You have some idea here what you're looking at. You have some idea, you have visual cues. You can see that there's headings. You can read them. They're nice, descriptive, short things that tell you what to expect. And if you happen to be looking for the base currency, you don't have to find it hidden in everything else. It's just there with its own heading. If you happen to want to find anything else, it's there with its own heading. Now, I could have added these not in bold, and just to prove that that would be absolutely useless, there you have it. It is the visual cueing with these words, not just the words, that makes the difference. Suppose then, instead of these nice, helpful short words, we had really kind of long things like securities selection, methodology, and criteria, which is kind of turgid, not very helpful. You know what? It's still better than that, isn't it? You can still find your way around a bit better. Now suppose that we look at the order of things. Now the order that these are in happens to be a very logical order. We're basically saying, here's what we're trying to do, here's what we're going to be looking at for possibilities, here's how we're going to decide about the possibilities that we find, and here's the units that we're going to use to measure our success. That seems pretty logical to me. Now, suppose we did this. We're going to talk about the management process a bit, then we're going to go on to base currency, then we're going to talk about the portfolio of securities, now we're going to come back and finish the management process, where finally we're going to end with the goal of the entire thing. You would say that's probably not the best order, and all the same information is there. It's still labeled, and very clearly, I think, but you're not really going to have a very good time with this. So let's just say you think, well, that's fine, but does this sort of thing really happen? Doesn't that sort of, don't all these documents sort of come in logical order? I would say the answer is no, and here is, in fact, an example. So a table of contents for a Luxembourg fund full prospectus. By the way, the ones in the United States are just as bad, so not picking on Luxembourg. The first section is about the business structure of the fund. The second is about the investments that are allowed by regulation, not what they're going to invest in, but what they could invest in. How they calculate the share price, how to buy and sell shares. We don't know what we're buying and selling yet, but here's how to do it. Business operations, what happens if the fund is dissolved, who does what, and dead last, main features of the product in which you are investing. Now, there are reasons why this is done this way. It sort of leads to the next insight. When documents don't communicate well, it's often because communication was never the main goal. So what would be the goal of a document if not to communicate? Well, there actually are plenty of them. Certainly it could be a legislative goal, a technical documentation goal, a compliance disclosure goal, could be litigation protection, could be a user manual. You might think those ought to be clear, except that the truth is that they are an added cost to manufacturers and they don't get any more revenue for them, so they very often cut corners. And then, as you may know, being users of certain things that have bad manuals, they're not always the best thing. All of these then go through, potentially, we hope, an exercise of plain language before they get to the user. So what we get out of that, I think, is that plain language is its own discipline. It is a separate process. It can be done by the people who write the original document, but it needs to be done to some extent as a separate process. It's a separate way of looking at things. Plain language isn't about regulation, it's about business. And I say this, and people have a tough time with it because it's been such a habit to think about it as being a regulatory matter. But it really is about business. It is about lowering costs. It's about taking, say, a bunch of stuff like this and making it into that, adding some visual appeal. It's about things like higher revenue flows, taking, again, a document like this, changing it only slightly. But in this case, 50% more of the forms were returned, and that's good because they all came with money. And 20% of them, fewer of them, were incomplete or incorrect. Better document management can be a goal. Again, Emmanuel is going to talk more about this. Fewer customer calls and complaints, a competitive edge is a possibility, stronger legal protection is a possibility. And people are starting to demand it, and this is something rather new. There is a cultural reason. So here is an example for you. This is Kesha. She is a very popular singer based in the United States. If you don't know who she is, any 12-year-old girl can tell you. And she has a song called Blah, 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 in which this chorus is, stop talking that blah, blah, blah. She's had over 20 million unique YouTube views for this. It's been very popular. And she's pretty clear about this. She really seems to mean business in the video. This is her answer for things. The meta message that I get out of this from the lyrics is, you're not sexy to me, guy, but you might be if you quit blabbing. I'm not going to rule it out. And that, I think, is a great metaphor for, I think, a consumer mentality that I certainly am seeing. As consumers, we're fine doing business with businesses, we're fine investing, we're fine with all of this stuff, but you really need to give us some straight talk and make the experience a bit better and pay a bit more attention to our concerns and needs. In other words, I would say plain language is part of a worldview that is on the rise. So looking at the old, oriented towards competition, there's now more of an orientation towards collaboration in this new view. The old, where it's a concern with limits, here it's really sort of looking at possibilities. The old with a concern on power, the new with a concern for more inclusiveness, pressure, giving way to motivation, insecurity, giving way to respect, commanding, the idea of giving orders, giving way to asking and to dialogue, and essentially, instead of saying why, to say why not. In terms of regulation, what's the least I can get away with versus where are the opportunities in this situation? And in communications, in transactions with customers, at customer touch points, that is to say where any business interacts with the customer, the old is the message, think advertising. The new is the meta message. And plain language is all about the meta message, what people take away from an interaction with you and a document that you put out. I want to end with these words. They are words for our time. They were spoken or written only last week. Make the client the focal point of your business again. Without clients, you will not make money. In fact, you will not exist. I don't know whether you like or don't like this fellow, but you probably recognize his name. This is the fellow from Goldman who called it quits in a very public way last week. And I think whatever you think of him, his words have a certain resonance. So, thank you.